Well, welcome everyone to our first History Happy Hour of the fall and winter of 2022 into 2023. If you're here for the first time, thank you for joining us. If you're here returning, thank you for coming back. We are really excited to start a new series of these over the next several months. For those who are maybe unfamiliar with the process, of course, in the summertime, we're able to have our walking tours here, Sunset at the Seminary, walking tours throughout four of those throughout the summer. And of course, in addition to all of the other summer programming that we do, the battle anniversary programming. But here in the fall and winter, since we're not all able to be at the same place at the same time, and especially as the weather cools, we like to have the opportunity to bring the content to you, those who support us, many of you, of course, being members of Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Cody H. I serve as Director of Education and Museum Operations here at Seminary Ridge. And before we jump into tonight's topic, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things, give you kind of a sense of what's been happening here on the Ridge and some things that are going to be happening. So we are coming to the conclusion here of a wonderful 2022 season. We've been able to increase our hours during the course of this season from 5 days to 6 days for the first time in a couple of years now. We have a wonderful staff, seasonal staff that we've been able to bring on board doing great things. And we've had a great series of content and of events throughout this summer. I mentioned already the battle anniversary. Of course, the first 3 days of July was the 159th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. It was our most involved and our most well-attended anniversary in several years here at Seminary Ridge. And so we're gearing up already, of course, for next year's big 160th anniversary. Many of you, I'm sure, were at the Legacy Weekend that we had back in September. So we thank you very much if you attended that. We'll have information soon on some other events taking place next year, including the symposium at the end of the winter and some other events that will be taking place as well. Let me go ahead and share my screen here, go over a couple of other brief things, other events that we have coming up here. If you're not already a member, and this is the first time that we have opened up these History Happy Hours to non-members. So if you're not a member, we really encourage you to continue supporting our museum. If you are interested in membership opportunities, we have both yearly as well as monthly ways to do so, monthly through our supply line. You can find that information on our website, simply seminaryridgemuseum.org. In addition to free admission and cupola tours through the course of the year, you get special invitations, discounts, also access to a full repository of all of the archived History Happy Hours, so that you're not just able to watch them live like we are here this evening, but you can go back and watch previous years as well as subsequent recordings of these. I will say this now, and I'll mention it at the end of our time together as well. Our next History Happy Hour is going to be next month, November 18th. That Friday at 6:30 p.m. We'll be discussing the story of Gettysburg's first Confederate monument, presented by yours truly. I'll have the pleasure to talk about the monument to the 1st Maryland Battalion, dedicated 23 years after the battle. But our next big event that we have coming up here is our second annual 24 Hours on the Ridge in support of the Adams County Community Foundation's annual giving spree. This is going to be on Wednesday, November 2nd, starting at 5 o'clock in the evening, running through 5 o'clock in the evening on Thursday, November 3rd. For 24 hours, the museum is going to be open. We're going to have speakers. We're going to have living historians, we're going to have trivia, film showings, tours, all sorts of events happening over the course of those 24 hours. Free admission to the museum, but we're going to be fundraising during that time, so your donations are very much appreciated in support, as I mentioned, of the Adams County Community Foundation's giving spree. I'll mention each of these things again as reminders when we get to the end of our discussion this evening. But without further ado, I'm going to turn things over now to Kaleb Kusmierczyk. Many of you know Kaleb as our Education and Visitor Services Coordinator. I'm sure many of you may have taken a cupola tour with Kaleb over the past few years, since he's been a great part of our team here at Seminary Ridge. Kaleb, take it away.
All righty, thanks, Cody. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about a topic that, in my opinion, doesn't get a whole lot of discussion in Civil War communities, and that is the postal system for both United States and Confederate armies throughout the war, really. It's a really fascinating subject to dive into. We're going to be looking at a bunch of different topics that all encompass the postal system as a whole, but we're not going to be going a deep dive into any particular one of those topics. There are full hour-long seminars on any of those categories. So if this does interest you, I do highly encourage you to do some of your own research at home, to go online to YouTube and such to learn a little more, because there is such a vast knowledge of Civil War postmarks, post systems, anything really to do with the postal system that was created for the Confederates, and then obviously that was maintained and implemented throughout the war for the United States here. So I'll mention on the first slide, you'll see an image that was used for the ad for this talk tonight. It's a Second Corps mail wagon, and that is something that we'll see come out of the war, is these postal systems or postal groups that are going to be assigned to specific armies, and that has a very functional use. It allows mail to be easily transported with the army and then be sent out in a more discreet way, rather than having to postmark each individual letter saying what town the army might be near. That way, if it crosses into the enemy's hand, they're not going to know where the larger army as a whole is located. So the armies are going to create their own postal systems to help, again, kind of evade the enemy movements if letters were captured by the enemy. So I just think that's a really neat image there from the Library of Congress showcasing that. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide here, Cody. All right, so why is the postal system important? There's kind of two main topics or points of interest that we're going to try to talk or touch on tonight. The first one, obviously, being that is important to the soldiers, right? It's their main form of communication. They're a landline, if you will, back to the home front. And so if we were to hop in a time machine, travel back to the 1860s and ask a soldier, ask a civilian, is this important to you? Is the postal service something that you deem important? I think for sure they would say yes. And so I think for that reason alone, it's important for us as historians today to look back and study this tool that we have here. And then it also provides us a story. Each stamp, each envelope, postmark tells a story. Oftentimes as historians, we like to learn what's on the inside of that envelope, the letter, and we can learn lots of information from that. But without the envelope, we are left with a incomplete story. So it doesn't tell us how it got from point A to point B. It doesn't tell you the postage that was used, and that's important because sometimes it tells us, at what point of the war it was sent, maybe the struggles that were going on in that particular location where it was being sent from. So a very integral part that is sometimes overlooked by historians today. And so that's the main reason we're going to talk about this topic tonight. Now, my personal connection to the Postal Service and the postal collection of these artifacts is an interesting one that started a little over probably 12 or 13 years ago when I was a young boy. Our neighbors across the street, he was a World War II veteran. He was a stamp collector, and he asked my brother and I if we had any interest in learning about stamps. And we said, yeah, absolutely. It sounds interesting enough. And so he took us to one of the meetings of the Philatelic Society just outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And it's through this meeting and subsequent meetings that we attended that I was able to start collecting some of these stamps of my own. And it's through those stamps, I was able to purchase then some Civil War stamps, some Confederate stamps, some United States stamps. That cover you see on your screen there is one such covers that is in my collection here. So it was the first time for me as a kid to purchase an artifact, hold in my hands a tangible piece of the past. And it's really what started me on my journey to becoming the historian I am here today. As a kid, being able to hold a piece of history like that, being infatuated with Gettysburg and the Civil War from a young age, allowed me to, and my mind, to just run wild with the thoughts and the possibilities of what the letter may have said that was in that envelope, or what that stamp that was on an envelope previously may have been sent from, who knows, a general, or even Lincoln himself, perhaps. But obviously, we know that there were hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of these stamps produced, and that the likelihood of those being the case was relatively slim. But still, as a kid, it was that excitement that drew me to the history field. And so it certainly does, I think, help tell the story as to why I love history and my passion from a young age. So that's another reason why I wanted to do this topic here tonight for all of you. Go ahead and advance to the next screen, Cody. All right, so we're going to start here talking about Lincoln. Now, we all know President Lincoln. He's the 16th president of the United States. He's the president for the United States during the time of the Civil War. So he's a central figure in almost any talk that involves the Civil War. And so the Postal Service talking about this is obviously going to be no exception. But Lincoln has a very intimate connection to the Postal Service. He's actually going to serve as a postmaster, or in a small town in Illinois, New Salem, in 1833. He was only 24 years old. And he was paid about $55 a year doing this job. But I can't help but think that even this, at a young age, was a perhaps political move for the young Lincoln. It's allowing him to meet people in the community. He's controlling the mail, being able to talk with pretty much anybody in the immediate area as they were coming to pick up the mail. The way that the Postal Service worked at that time was, you would go, if you wanted to send a letter to the post office, you would address it to whoever it is that you wanted to send that letter to. You pay the postage, and then you would leave it in the post office. Then the recipient, whenever it is that they would make it to the post office, would come and receive that letter. These were known as drop mail. And so this was fairly common throughout the United States. It really wasn't until about the time of the Civil War that you're going to start to see mail being delivered to homes. Now, the young Lincoln would actually observe some of these notes or letters being left behind in the post office. And if they were there for an extended period of time, he would take these letters and actually deliver them himself. And it was said that he supposedly carried those letters to their destination in his tall hat. So that's one of the ways, or one possible reason for him earning that nickname, Honest Abe, because he was carrying sometimes sensitive information, and he was entrusted with delivering that. So hopefully throughout the talk tonight, we'll see this idea, or this strand of Lincoln, kind of dragging its way through tonight, and we'll eventually end with another connection to the 16th president. Go ahead and advance to the next screen here. All right. So what you see here is a just general brief timeline of kind of major events that are leading up to the Civil War, and some of the events that are happening on the postal side of things here. So it starts with South Carolina seceding on December 20th, 1860. Next up, we'll see that there is, in between January and February, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana are all going to leave the Union as well. Then on February 4th, 1861, all of those previous listed states are going to formally come together and create the Confederate States of America. On March 2nd, Texas is going to join them. And then if we fast forward a little bit to March 5th, Montgomery Blair will be appointed as the Postmaster General for the United States by Abraham Lincoln. Just a day later, John Regan is going to be appointed the Postmaster General for the Confederates. So Regan is a congressman who, from Texas, who will actually give up his seat to go be loyal to the South. And then on November 12th, of course, we know the famous shots were fired upon Fort Sumter. So that marking the official beginning of war hostilities against the United States and Confederate States. And then in May, on the 27th, Postmaster Blair is going to put out a decree claiming that all of the southern states currently in rebellion, their mail would be halted after May 31st. Now that's interesting because Reagan pretty much turns around and decides to put out a decree of his own, claiming that the postal service for the Confederacy will be up and operational by June 1st. So that gives you some idea of how fast things were moving for the Confederates to get those things into place to make sure that they were able to deliver the mail on June 1st, just a few months after Reagan had been appointed. So it's true they were using most of the same systems that were implemented by the United States, same postmasters for the most part, were still controlling the mail in their local areas. But the big thing here is that there's no official stamps for the Confederacy, and they're not going to officially be created and distributed for another couple months yet. And we're going to look at what those stamps look like here in just a minute. But go ahead and advance to the next slide for me. All right, so here's a picture of Reagan. He is, as I said, from Texas. He's going to withdraw from the House of Representatives, giving up his seat to go stay or go be loyal to the South, serving as their postmaster. Now, Reagan, something that's interesting about him is he has a very tough job, but he does it very well. He's going to, by the end of the war, run the postal system in the South so successfully that they're actually able to turn a profit. Now, that is something that sounds relatively easy, but it's not, especially when you're only selling stamps that are 5-cent value, 10-cent value. So that's something that he was able to do well. And we're going to mention him throughout tonight's talk, and we'll see what happens to him at the close of the war as well. Go ahead and advance to our next slide here. All right, so this is an image of Montgomery Blair, the United States Postmaster General. And so he is going to serve under Abraham Lincoln in that role until he will eventually be relieved by Lincoln. But Blair is a pretty ardent abolitionist. He actually is well known for a pretty famous lawsuit that takes place in the United States history. You may all be familiar, at least heard of the famous case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, and that eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court, in which Scott was suing for his freedom. Now, ultimately, we know that he does not win that case, but it is recognition nonetheless that Blair does receive here. So at the outbreak of the war, when the southern states do leave the Union, Blair almost immediately starts putting out some of these decrees. He says that the Confederate postmasters in the South that were choosing to break away from the Union, not stay loyal to them, were essentially acting as treasonous acts, and that he believes that they had over $270,000 worth of postage in the form of marked envelopes or actual postage stamps. And so he's going to put a plan into place to create new stamps for the United States to use. This was in a hopes to prevent the Confederates from using the United States mail services kind of fraudulently. Now, giving credit to the Confederates here, up until the Confederates have their postal service in place, when they are sending mail using United States stamps, they were still sending that money to Washington. So that's an interesting thought there, that although these two sides are getting ready to war, they still were making sure that they were sending that money to Washington, D.C. So fascinating to think that, in a few years, these guys are going to be so bitterly divided. They already were at that point, but they still were sending a check to DC almost weekly or monthly at that point. I'll go ahead and advance to the next slide here, Cody. All right, so what we have here are the United States stamps. So the stamps on the left side of that red line there, those are going to be the old stamps. Those are the 1857 series. And those are going to be effectively out of circulation after that cutoff date of July 1st. And so what you're going to see then is a switch to the stamps on the right side of that red line. And so only postage with those stamps on it would be circulated through the system. If you sent a letter prior to that cutoff date with one of the older stamps on it, you would find your letter would have a stamp going across the postage stamp that says invalid stamp or insufficient funds or something to that effect. And so that would then be returned to the sender or would make its way to the dead letter office. The dead letter office is typically where letters that could not be forwarded to their the correct address would go. Typically, there were older men that were respected in the community that were there that would go through the letters to try to get them sorted out to be sent where they needed to get to. If they were unable to be forwarded to the correct location and the improper postage was not due, typically they would just destroy the letters at that time. Go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right, so this is what the Confederate stamps would look like. These are the general issue stamps. So general issue stamps means that these were what the Confederate government was producing. And we're going to talk here what some of those other stamps would have looked like. But this is what the government itself was having paid and produced for the citizens to use. So you'll see there are a variety of people that are featured on these stamps. Probably the most frequent of which you'll see Jefferson Davis's likeness used on 5 or 6 of these stamps. So starting off, kind of going in numerical order there with the first stamp on the top left is Jefferson Davis. That's the first stamp that the Confederacy will issue. The second one over there is Thomas Jefferson. It's a little hard to make that out. The next one over is Andrew Jackson, followed by another image of Jefferson Davis, another Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson Davis, Jefferson Davis. If we move down to the bottom row there, the first one on the left, the red 2-cent piece, that is Andrew Jackson, followed by 4 more Jefferson Davises. And the green stamp that you see there is George Washington. And the last stamp pictured is John C. Calhoun. Now, what you're seeing on the screen here, these are facsimiles of a full set of Confederate stamps that were issued. Again, these were in my private collection, and they were the most clear. Unfortunately, I have a few of the originals, but they are quite faded and hard to see. So for demonstration purposes, for showing purposes, we decided to use the facsimiles just to give you a sense of what they would have looked like down to the color. The most of these are printed off of the original printing presses from the time. So although they're not original to 1860s, they do come from the same mold. So obviously much cheaper to own as well than the originals. But there is one that I like to draw your attention to here, and that's the one at the bottom center with the arrow directly underneath of it. You'll notice that there are kind of 4 that look almost exactly alike. The one has 10 cents kind of spelled out, and the other 3 have 10 cents in the numerical. Now, the one with the arrow under it, that one's unique because you can see there is a border around the image portion. That border is indicative of CSA number 10. That's the number of that stamp. And the reason for that is because of the printing process for each of these stamps. So each one was different. There were 3 different types of printing that was used, but that one was used basically by a block, an individual block that they would put ink on that had the image etched into it. And so when they put that block down onto the large pieces of paper to make a sheet, each one would have a perfect square around it to mark that. So you can see that it's different in that way, even though it looks very similar to the other ones around it. All right, go ahead and advance to the next slide for me. All right, so there are the 3 different types. The image to the right there, really briefly, it's really a unique print plate because it's captured by some United States forces during the war. And it's actually currently in the procession of the Smithsonian, the National Postal Museum. And it is depicting one of those stamps that we just saw that had Jefferson Davis on it in the 5 cent. But there are 3 kind of different types. There was lithography, yes, topography or topography, yeah, and integral. So that one, the last one there is actually probably going to be the most complicated. That one is a solid sheet of copper, and it involved an artist basically sitting there with these sharp instruments or tools, carving out each individual line. It's the ones that you'll notice have the most cross hatching on them to give them shading and such. So these were the most time consuming to produce. And so for that reason, they weren't used all that often. The Confederacy will be the only country to actually utilize all 3 of these different printing types or styles at any given time. You can go ahead and advance to the next screen for me. All right, so blackjack. So if you noticed, the Confederates have an image of Andrew Jackson there on the right. That's a red postage stamp. And then on the left, there is a black United States postage stamp that also depicts Andrew Jackson. And these stamps are obviously from different sides of this conflict. One's Confederate, one's United States. They both depict the same person, and it has the same value to it. And it's the exact same image. The same painting was used for inspiration for both of these stamps. So that's an interesting piece because you have these 2 different sides who are still obviously have very similar past and history, and we see that translated here through the stamps. They're going to use the likeness of both Andrew Jackson on both sides here for their stamps. So it's a fascinating comparison to look at the 2, and it's interesting that they choose to place him on both a 2 cent stamp for both sides here. Go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right, so provisionals. This is one of those topics that we're just going to briefly talk about, but there are almost an endless possibilities of provisionals. So these are the stamps that each individual postmaster across the South is going to create and produce prior to those general stamps, those 15 stamps that we just saw, before those were created. So what you see here, this is a 2 cent stamp, comes from New Orleans, and you can see that the postmaster's name for New Orleans is on the stamp there. So this is a fairly ornate stamp. It's not too complicated, but some of these provisionals are very complicated, very complex, ornate designs that go across them. And so they're very collectible from a stamp collector's point of view. They are some of the most rare stamps to collect, but they are fascinating to look at because, again, they tell the story of really overcoming that lack of unity, that lack of kind of the same stamps that we see like in the United States, that the Confederates are all left kind of up to their own to create stamps to make sure that the mail is continuing to move around those southern states. Go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right, so the next type of mail that we're going to look at here is a flag of truce. So this is mail that was going to go across the line, either from north to south or south to north. So this is a very rare example where you'll see a United States stamp on a cover alongside a Confederate state stamp. And you'll see that there are 2 postmarks on there, one from the northern states, one from the southern states. So that mail, once it got to the other side of the Mason-Dixon, if it was going to the north and it had a Confederate stamp on it, you needed to put United States postage on it. If it was going south, you had to put Confederate postage on it. Now, the United States they're actually going to create a law, Blair, saying that no mail was supposed to be handed over to go south with its original postage stamp on it. So a lot of times when you find a cover like this one, if it started off in the north and went south, the United States stamp there has been peeled off, and you'll be able to see kind of what looks like the gum, the outline of the stamp where it was on the cover there. So that's an interesting piece there. And again, pretty rare to come across something quite like that. Go ahead and advance to our next slide here. All right, so POW letter, this is kind of a same idea as a flag of truce, except this is going to be a letter that is going to be examined at the prison before it is sent out into circulation, just to make sure that there's nothing that shouldn't be mentioned in the letter there, and make sure there's nothing that could potentially hurt the Army before it went out into circulation. And so you can see on the screen there, the prisoner's letter examined, it says, and then typically you'll see where that prison camp was located, in this case, Fort Delaware. So again, another pretty rare example of a postal cover that, you know, we can learn something from it. It tells us that this person was in prison in a POW camp, that the letter was examined, and that it was sent from Delaware on October 21st. So it's another fascinating piece. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. All right, so this is probably one of the most common as far as a Civil War soldier's envelope would go. So soldiers during the Civil War typically didn't have access to stamps very often. And so they were allowed, both sides, North and South, created laws and passed regulations that they were able to send letters postage due. And so that's what you see here. It says written on the top there, soldier's letter, and then a name, and then due 3. So that would be 3 cents due. And how this would work is upon receiving that letter, the receiver would then have to pay for it. And otherwise they weren't given that letter. And so that's how they were able to send the letters through the mail without actually having to physically pay the postmaster to send those letters home. Interesting enough, for the Confederates, they actually said that soldiers could do this, but as well members of Congress. So you can imagine that was not very popular for many Southerners. Imagine getting a letter from your representative or senator, and you have to pay for it to receive it. I don't think too many people today would be happy with that. So obviously most government officials elected not to do that. I'll go ahead and advance to the next screen here. So a not so standard system. So although this system was up and running, it was functional, it didn't necessarily mean that these soldiers were getting letters as often or as frequently as they would have liked, or as they were sending them out and not receiving them back. For these armies, as they're moving, right, we talked about the US mail of the Second Corps there. It was a lot to maintain moving the army and receiving letters. So not very often were you able to get multiple letters in a row. Typically, if you had them come in, they would kind of bind them all together, and then you would receive almost like a small package of letters all at once if they kind of all collected at one area. But the quote here says, "We have moved so often that letters couldn't find us. Write often, and I will run the risk of getting the letters." So kind of a half-hearted joking that, you know, these guys aren't getting letters as often as they wish they were. They're sure that the letters are probably being written and being sent, but the system certainly has its flaws. I think we see that today in some regards as well. I'll go ahead and advance to the next slide here. So a hand stamp cover, this is kind of goes along the idea of provisionals. These are stamps that you can see depicted here on the kind of top right of the envelope there. It says paid, it's a little faint, and then a 5, so 5 cents is what it costs to send this letter through, appears Georgia there. And so these are kind of, again, up to the discretion of the postmaster of each of these small towns. So what we looked at earlier was a provisional from New Orleans, and those were more common for larger cities to have a official stamp, something that was glued on the back and had a kind of ornate design. Now, if you're a smaller town, maybe in the backwoods of Georgia here, we don't have that kind of money to produce stamps like that. You probably just make a stamp out of wood and carve in your the town name, paid, and the amount paid. And that's what you see here. That's pretty common. And so there are literally whole catalogs full of these different hand stamp paids and provisionals, because there were just so many different variations. Not only the actual stamp, but the color of ink that was used. There were all kinds of different variations. And so from the collector standpoint, there is almost an infinite number of different possibilities to collect. Go ahead and advance to the next slide here. So during the war, especially as it goes on and the United States is blockading the southern states, it gets very hard for postage or mail to be sent in something like an envelope. There is a really bad shortage. There's an ink shortage as well. And so there's this really great quote, it comes from Anna Simpson. And her memoir, she remembers saying, quote, that a favorite night's employment was found in making envelopes. No bits of white paper suitable for writing with pen and ink could be wasted in envelopes. Thus, it happened that wallpaper and sheets with pictures on one side, taken from the United States explorations, served to make envelopes neat enough. These were stuck together with gum from peach trees. And so, again, we see the disadvantage that the southern side has, right? Not only do they only have about 15 paper mills to produce all of these goods, but they don't have the ability to bring in goods like paper, like ink from England because of that blockade. Now, there were still pieces that did make it through, but they were pretty rare. There's mail that will be sent through the blockade, again, for an extra fee. And those also had a stamp on them that denoted that. And those blockade runner captains of those ships would actually take a cut of that. But the adversity that was going on in the South is really, truly felt at every level. And I really love this quote because it shows that this lady who's having to rip off wallpaper to be able to fashion an envelope to send a letter. It really makes it, I think, brings it home for you to realize that this was not just a war on the battlefield. This was something impacting everybody in their everyday lives. Go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right, so this is an example of an adversary cover. It is made from wallpaper. This particular one comes from the Library of Congress. And what you're seeing here, why it looks like there's a little corner basically, is that the corner flap is flipped open to show you the wallpaper pattern on the inside of the envelope there. So if that were pulled down, you would just see pretty much the white or cream colored outside of the envelope that was written on to address the letter to. And so it's a unique, very rare a piece of postal history, because again, it shows the lengths people were going through to be able to send letters. And so I think, again, this goes back to the idea that this institution, the idea of the Postal Service, was important enough that they're taking wallpaper and fashioning envelopes into out of those. This stamp is actually a unique one too, because you can see that the cancel on it, or the marking, instead of having a lack of a better word, a stamp or a ink stamp over it, it's manuscript. The postmaster for this town chose, for whatever reason, if they didn't have a stamp made for that, just took a pen and wrote over it. And so that is how they knew that that stamp was used, is by canceling it. That's what that's called. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right, so during the Civil War, the United States is also going to start producing revenue stamps. And these are going to be stamps that are used or put on kind of everyday items. So your pack of playing cards, perfume. The examples that you see here is on the back of a CDV. All of these come from my private collection as well, but they show the progression of stamps. Now, they're not just being used for postal, but for other uses to collect taxes. And you can see that through the US Internal Revenue, which is printed on these. So again, another aspect of stamps that are not just being used now for sending postage, but now going to the store and buying goods. This is how you were going to pay the tax to the federal government. They decide to do this basically because the war is expensive. They need a way to fund their war efforts. So July 1st in 1862, the government creates the Revenue Act. And so it's through that Congress approves these stamps to go on goods to collect those taxes here. So you can see on the elongated blue stamp of Washington there, it says 1865, June 14th, and it's a 50-cent piece, I think. Yeah, to go on a life insurance a policy, so something from a lawyer. So these are almost any imaginable good that could be taxed. This is how they tax those typically. Again, to help generate revenue for the United States to pay for the war effort. You can go ahead and advance here. So forged stamps obviously are going to start becoming an issue because the prices slowly begin to go up. It's obviously something that's harder and harder for people to get with paper shortages and such. So there are going to be forgeries that start to pop up. And you can see an example of a book that was used or created to help identify these forgeries. But another way that stamps were used or kind of in a legal way was by reusing stamps that were already sent through the mail. So if it had a light cancel on it, if it was one that didn't look like it had been through the postage system already, typically folks would try to scrape it or peel it off. If you cut out the corner of the envelope and you soak the stamp in water, it'll actually release the gum from the back side. You can dry that stamp out and then you re-gum it. And if you're able to rub off the cancel on it or kind of cover over it enough, you could reuse that stamp. Now, obviously that's illegal, frowned upon, should not have been done, but you know, it's things that people were doing to try to reuse those stamps. Go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right. So the Confederacy falls. Eventually, I think this comes to no surprise for everyone watching here, that the Confederacy does fail. And when it does, we often see or hear the idea that Jefferson Davis was captured wearing women's clothes or had his wife's shawl wrapped around him. But one person who will be captured with Davis is the postmaster for the Confederacy. So that gives you some idea of where his standings were. He was fairly high in the government, fairly well respected, to the point that he was captured with the president as he was fleeing. So he's arrested on May 8th, 1865. And he's going to be imprisoned for about 2 years, held at Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. He will eventually be pardoned and released. This is John Regan. And he'll be sent back to his home in Texas. He's eventually going to return back to Congress, holding a seat there, and chairman of a committee on the post offices and postal roads. So he still remains connected in the postal service even after the war ends and he returns back to the United States, goes back to Congress, and remains an integral part in maintaining and returning the Confederates' postal system back into the United States postal system. So go ahead and advance to the next slide here. All right, so the picture here, this is the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln by Francis Carpenter in 1864. The gentleman you see pictured with the red ring around him, that is Montgomery Blair. So again, another prominent figure who is making his way through the president's cabinet and obviously has the president's ear. But he's eventually going to be replaced by Lincoln in September of 64. Lincoln, that is going to accept one of Blair's previous offers to resign. And so he will be replaced. But his impact or his lasting legacy on the Postal Service is that he is going to be the first postmaster to use the rail system, to use rail cars to move mail over large distances, something that will officially become implemented in the postal system during and after the war. And that a large part of that is because of Blair. Now, it's reported that Blair told his wife after being let go by Lincoln that it was from the best motives of the president and it is for the best all around. So clearly, by that time, perhaps Blair and Lincoln were not seeing maybe eye to eye on most issues here. But his administration also did create a free city delivery system, so meaning that mail could be delivered within local cities free of charge. And that would then allow them to deliver directly to individuals' homes. Something that as we mentioned before, moving away from that drop letter where you would go to the post office and leave it and wait for somebody else to pick it up. Now it's being delivered to your house. And then go ahead and advance to our last slide here. All right, so this is the morning stamp. It's the first morning stamp in the United States, and it depicts President Lincoln. So we said we were going to start with Lincoln, and we're going to end with Lincoln. Lincoln is obviously the kind of central figure throughout the whole Civil War. And we know that he has a tragic demise right near the end. And so this stamp really embodies the feelings of a nation at that time. It's going to be created or put out on April 14th, 1866. So just about a year after his assassination. The long-lasting legacy of this is that eventually, beginning with President Roosevelt in 1945, the Postal Service started a new practice, and that was that every president would be honored with a commemorative stamp within 1 year and 4 days of their passing. So this is the start of a tradition. It obviously goes to show how moved the country was that a stamp like this was so well received and utilized by people at that time. So again, it's the first of what we now have a regular system in place for creating stamps like these, but it's in part thanks to that man right there, President Lincoln. All right. Well, that about wraps up my side of things here. That leaves us with about 10 minutes for questions.
Kaleb, we have, and thank you very much for a fascinating presentation, a look, as you said, at something that's quite overlooked. We do have a couple of comments in the chat, so I'll go ahead and I'll take,
Sure.
let you take those first, and then we'll open it up to the floor if anybody has any. Two that are sort of overlapping here. Matthew asked a question a little bit before you sort of answered it in the course of your talk there, and Andrew followed up with something along these lines. So I'll just put both of these to you. Matthew asked, what happened after May 1861 if you mailed something to the Confederate States? Did the Postal Service return the piece of mail since delivery to the South was no longer being done? And of course, you talked about the flag of truce and you know how that fit in. Andrew, I'll throw this one in there as well, asked for the flag of truce letters. how would you get a stamp from the other side? So throw those two overlapping questions to you.
Yeah, sure. So the flag of truce typically is if it went to a postmaster. There was one in particular in basically the tip of Virginia. He was the only certified postmaster to be sending mail through the lines, and I believe it was his cousin ran a postal office in the northern side of Virginia, and he ran the one just on the Maryland side. So they were currying these letters through, and you'll see on some specific covers that they are addressed to a DB, I think it was Dowd, something like that. And that is where most of these letters were funneled through to him. And then that's where those stamps were taken off or put on. But typically, yeah, if you didn't have a Confederate stamp, the Confederate, and you were going from the north, sending a letter south, it was the Confederate postmaster to put that stamp on there or leave it on as a postage due. So they were going to send it down. When it made its way to its final destination, then it would be, they would have to pay for it there. Yeah.
All right. We have an unidentified questioner who asks, when an item was taxed and stamped, would the money for the stamp go from the Postal Service into the government?
So the revenue stamps went completely to the revenue department. Yeah, so I just threw those in there, although they're not technically postage stamps. I lumped them in because they are a new form of stamp that comes out of the Civil War that existed, and because it's another stamp that I think played a major role in the war efforts here. So that money went strictly to the revenue department. Yeah.
Dave asks, did Union soldiers use the United States Postal Service to vote?
They do, yeah. So that's another reason that the Postal Service is so important. It's the way that these men were able to have their voices heard in elections. So a lot of soldiers write about, having their votes, casting their votes at camp, and writing that all their friends are going to vote this way or that way, or thinking how the election may go. Those are interesting letters to read, but yeah, they certainly did vote by mail.
And of course, that's another way we can tie Lincoln into this story, is the fact that he gets an overwhelming amount of the soldier vote in 1864 goes a long way in his re-election campaign, as well as we are, of course, living amid a couple of weeks here, extremely significant midterm elections, and the midterm elections of 1862, participation by the American populace at that point in time, as well as soldiers.
Yeah, it's another thing that we still do today, especially we saw record numbers with the pandemic of people turning to voting by mail to have their voices heard. So yeah, it's again, another connection you can draw from today to the past.
Those are all the submitted questions in the comments. If anybody has another question, either drop it there, feel free, or feel free to unmute yourself or turn off your camera and ask away if you'd like. Oh, actually, we got another one here. Richard asks, could you speak further about how the stamps, themselves? I assume they were printed in sheets. The US stamps appeared to have serrated edges, which I assume could be pulled apart using those serrated edges. The Confederate stamps appeared to require being separated using scissors. Did both sides then require the user to place some sort of adhesive on the back of the stamp?
Nope. So these stamps, I'll start with the last part there first. So stamps were all, they all came pre-gummed. So that's the term that they use in the philatelic societies. Is gum is the sticky substance on the back that you would lick and then put on the envelope there. So they come pre-gummed, but let's see, the first part of that is sheets. Yeah, so earlier in the presentation, you saw the large kind of pieces of a printing press, basically. They were these large, I think in that particular case, there are about 400 individual 5-cent stamps there. And so they would put a large piece of paper there, they ink the side of that mold and then place it on the sheets of paper. And then that would be sent to your postmasters. Now, this is the part I was thinking about earlier that I do find somewhat comical, that Today, stamp collectors, one of the things they look at with these stamps is the margins, or how centered the inked portion is in the middle of the cuts in this case. So the Confederates didn't have perforated stamps. That's what those little ripples are around where you could rip them apart. They were all hand cut. And so thinking about the hundreds, if not thousands of stamps, if you're in a large post office, that these guys were sitting there with scissors cutting out. And here we are almost 160 years later, having these men, typically people, stamp collectors, sitting there with a magnifying glass and a ruler counting the millimeters between the edges of the ink and the paper. I think is somewhat comical, because who would think in 160 years from today, if somebody was sitting there with a magnifying glass scrutinizing my work, be kind of crazy to think. But yeah, they were cut by scissors, the Confederate stamps at least, and then the United States, they were perforated, so they just pulled apart.
Louise asks, how in the world did the Postal Service actually locate where the soldiers were?
So they were following with the Army, basically. So early on, it's going to be very hit or miss, especially with the armies moving around. But once they create those kind of separate or designated postal systems to go with the Army, right? You're just going to address your letter to the 2nd Corps, 3rd Division, and then that's going to be sent through the lines until it gets to the Army, and then from the kind of Army as a larger, it's going to make its way to that division or corps as a whole. So it was a lot of luck, but there was the systems in place to move the line, or move the mail through the lines fairly successfully. It's kind of similar to how it works today, just without computers, right? There's a lot of log books and such to keep track of the mail and make sure it was going.
Tony asks a great question here related to social aspects of this manner. How were free and enslaved blacks on both sides treated in using the Postal Service?
That is a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I didn't see or come across anything in the research that mentions the African Americans' use during the Civil War, during the Postal Service. So I would assume that they were there, that they played some role. I guess probably as teamsters for the wagons and such, but I don't know. I'm happy to research that and look into that more. But yeah.
As always, the mark of a good Q&A is a question that stumps you, that inspires you to look a little further.
Exactly.
Another unidentified anonymous question here. Why did Montgomery Blair resign?
That one is not, forget the exact reason, but Lincoln, from what I found, Lincoln just takes him up on a previous offer and has him replaced. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah.
And also the thing to consider there is, as is common amid re-election campaigns in particular, typically in anticipation of a re-election campaign 4 years into the administration, oftentimes you'll see some changeover there as well. And we see a couple of cabinet members changing in Lincoln's administration. Salmon Chase, maybe most famously another there. Richard asks another question regarding the stamps themselves. So then the postmaster separated the stamps as individual stamps and they were sold individually?
Yeah, so typically you would get the stamps going physically to the post office with your mail, and that's where they would put the stamp on. It's not quite like today where you go and you just buy a pack of stamps. You would have to go and they would put the stamps on for you as they're then canceling it and sending it through. So yeah, they were sold pretty much exclusively at the post office to be sold and used right there. Yeah.
Any other questions as we wind down here? All right, well, seeing none, thank you again, Kaleb, for a wonderful presentation. Hopefully will cause us all to think a little more about stamps and the Postal Service and its significance, of course, to our lives, and with that, the significance as we think about and learn about the Civil War and its soldiers and the people who lived now 160 years ago. In closing, just want to return to a couple of themes we talked about a little bit ago. Pull up the housekeeping here just one more time. If you're not a member already, which we know many of you are, and we thank you so much for that support, we encourage you to to consider visiting seminaryridgemuseum.org and look at the membership options that are available there. We have the annual membership, a traditional membership means there, but also our supply line where you can contribute monthly and receive some of the benefits of membership. Our next History Happy Hour is going to be, as I mentioned, Friday, November 18th. Of course, going into Remembrance Day weekend and Dedication Day weekend, we're going to take a look at an event that took place on November 19th, not 1863, but 1886, 23 years after the battle. I'm going to have the pleasure of diving into the story of Gettysburg's first Confederate monument. It's a rather controversial story, the story of this monument coming to the Gettysburg battlefield, and really kind of inspires a lot of the debates that we still continue to have today over Civil War memory and monumentation right here on the Gettysburg battlefield. But I'll mention one more time, our next big event here in a couple of weeks, we really look forward to having our second annual 24 Hours on the Ridge in support of the Adams County Community Foundation's annual giving spree. The museum is going to be open for 24 hours. We're going to have speakers and tours and living historians, events all through the night, all through the day. We hope that you'll come out. Museum admission is going to be free, but we are asking for donations as we go through the Community Foundation's giving spree. Again, our second annual 24 Hours on the Ridge, that'll be Wednesday, November 2nd, Thursday, November 3rd. We really hope to see you there. Thank you all again for tuning in. We hope you have a nice evening.